What if the greatest weapon in history wasn't a blade or a shield, but something far more unexpected, a simple quill dipped in ink? Picture this, a time when kings and warriors ruled by brute force, their power measured in armies and castles. Yet beneath the clang of swords and the roar of battle, a quieter revolution was unfolding. Words, carefully written on parchment, began to shape the fate of nations. This is the story of how ink defeated the sword, a tale where the Iron Crown bowed to the paper throne. Think of the mightiest medieval rulers, their names etched in history, not just by conquest, but by the treaties they signed, the laws they enacted, the letters they exchanged. A single document could end wars, forge alliances, or strip a tyrant of his power. The written word became a force more enduring than any army, outlasting the lifespan of steel and the reigns of kings. Monasteries and scriptoriums, once seen as quiet retreats, turned into battlegrounds of influence. Scribes and scholars wielded their pens like generals, drafting the ideas that would redefine empires. This journey takes us beyond the battlefield, into the shadows where true power often resided. We'll uncover how a well-crafted charter could secure a dynasty's legacy, how a poet's verses could sway a monarch's heart, and how the slow, deliberate stroke of a pen could achieve what 1,000 swords could not. The Iron Crown may have glittered with authority, but the paper throne held the real keys to control. So let's step into this hidden world where ink flowed like a silent river, carving valleys of influence through the landscape of history. By the end, you'll never look at a medieval manuscript the same way again. Consider the sheer scale of Charlemagne's empire stretching across much of Western Europe, a patchwork of languages, customs, and loyalties. How did one man govern such a vast domain without the instant communication of today? The answer lies in the quiet revolution of parchment and ink. His capitularies, those meticulously drafted decrees, didn't just announce laws, they bound distant regions to a single vision of order. Each document was a thread in the fabric of empire, woven by scribes whose hands shaped history as surely as any blacksmith forging a sword. Then there's the Domesday Book, William the Conqueror's audacious project to catalogue every piece of land, every ox, every peasant in England. Imagine the shock of nobles discovering their wealth and their obligations spelled out in unflinching detail. This wasn't just a survey, it was a masterstroke of control. For the first time, a king could tax with precision, reward loyalty, and crush dissent armed not with an army but with indisputable records. The message was clear: ignorance was no longer an excuse. Knowledge carefully inscribed became the ultimate leverage, but the true power of these documents lay in their permanence. A sword rusts, a castle crumbles, but words on parchment could outlive their authors. When a king died, his treaties didn't. When a rebellion was quashed, the records of its leaders' punishments remained, a warning to future dissenters. Monasteries, those unlikely fortresses of influence, became archives of authority, their shelves stacked with charters that could make or break a claim to power. The scribe's desk, not the knight's saddle, became the seat of real governance. And let's not forget the subtle artistry of these documents. A well-placed seal, a flourish of Latin, even the quality of the parchment, all signaled legitimacy. A forgery could spark a war, while a lost deed might erase a family's inheritance. In this world, the scribe's pen was both sword and shield, crafting realities as tangible as any battlefield victory. The medieval bureaucrat, often overlooked in tales of glory, was the silent architect of empires, proving that control wasn't just about who wielded the sharpest blade, but who held the keenest quill. Take the town of Bruges in the 12th century, a muddy trading post until Count Philip of Flanders granted it a charter. Overnight, its merchants gained the right to hold markets, enforce laws, and levy taxes without noble interference. Suddenly, Bruges wasn't just a dot on the map. It was a humming engine of commerce, its wealth growing faster than any fortress could conquer. That's the alchemy of a royal charter, a few lines of ink transforming dirt roads into arteries of empire. But these documents weren't just economic superchargers, they were social equalizers too. When King Henry II granted a charter to the weavers of Oxford, he didn't just give them the right to sell cloth. He broke the monopoly of local lords who'd pocketed their profits for generations. Serfs who once bowed to arbitrary fines now had written proof of their rights. A guildsman could point to parchment and say, "This protects me," in a way no sword ever could. The irony, many charters were granted to buy loyalty or fund wars, yet their unintended consequences often outlasted the kings who signed them. Monasteries played the long game with charters too. A clever abbot might secure a document guaranteeing his land's independence, only to see it invoked centuries later when a greedy monarch came knocking. The Abbey of Cluny, for instance, used its stack of charters like a legal shield, defying kings and popes alike by waving parchment older than their dynasties. And when disputes arose, the side with the better-kept archives usually won. Yet for all their power, charters had a fragile side. A single fire could erase a town's rights. A forged signature might plunge a region into chaos. That's why the smartest rulers treated their scribes like treasurers, because in the end, the ink-stained hands drafting these documents held more leverage than the armored ones swinging swords. The lesson: in the medieval world, the sharpest weapon wasn't always steel. Sometimes it was a well-timed flourish of a quill. Imagine a room where the only sounds are the scratch of quills on parchment and the occasional sigh of a tired monk. This was the scriptorium, the medieval equivalent of a propaganda factory. While knights clashed on battlefields, monks waged a subtler war in these quiet chambers, copying texts with painstaking precision. Every stroke of their pens didn't just preserve knowledge, it shaped reality. The church, holding a near monopoly on literacy, understood something warlords often missed: control the written word, and you control history itself. Take the case of the Venerable Bede, an English monk whose Ecclesiastical History of the English People didn't just record events, it crafted a narrative of Christian triumph. His account of pagan kings converting to the faith wasn't neutral reporting. It was persuasion in ink. Kings who once claimed divine right through bloodlines now needed the church's stamp of approval, literally written into existence by cloistered scribes. A well-placed line in a chronicle could sanctify a ruler or damn him as a tyrant for posterity. Then there's the darker side of this power. When Pope Innocent III declared the Albigensian Crusade against heretics in southern France, it wasn't just swords that enforced his will. Pamphlets and decrees flooded the region, painting dissenters as existential threats. These weren't mere announcements, they were psychological warfare. A single papal bull could turn neighbors against each other, all because the local priest read aloud words penned hundreds of miles away in a silent scriptorium. But perhaps the most ingenious use of scriptoriums was their role as medieval copy machines. Before the printing press, reproducing a book took months of labor. That meant the church could curate knowledge like a gatekeeper. Want Aristotle's philosophy, you'd get it, but filtered through Christian commentary. A monk might edit a classical text by adding marginal notes that steered readers toward orthodox interpretations. Even the choice of which books to copy was a form of control. Lose a manuscript to decay, and you might erase an entire school of thought from memory. Yet for all their influence, scriptoriums had an unexpected weakness. The very act of copying introduced errors, tiny mutations in text that could snowball over generations. A mistranslated word in a Bible passage might spark theological debate centuries later, and sometimes a rebellious scribe would sneak in his own opinions between the lines, proving that even the most controlled systems had cracks. The parchment battlefield was never truly silent. It thrummed with the quiet friction of competing truths, where every dip of the quill was a move in a game far older than any kingdom. The year 1215 marked a turning point where ink proved mightier than a king's wrath. Picture the scene at Runnymede, King John, backed into a corner by his own barons, grudgingly pressing his seal into wax on a document that would echo through centuries. The Magna Carta wasn't just a list of demands, it was a blueprint for a radical idea. For the first time, written words could shackle a monarch's whims, proving that even the crown's divine authority had limits. What made this parchment so revolutionary? It wasn't the specifics, tax reforms or inheritance laws, but the principle it enshrined. No one, not even a king, stood above the law. Imagine the shockwaves this sent through a world where rulers claimed power by divine right. A single clause buried in the text would later inspire revolutions. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his peers. Centuries before democracies took shape, that line planted a seed. Justice wasn't just the king's will, but something measurable, something written. Yet the Magna Carta's true power lay in its survival. King John tried to annul it within weeks, plunging England into civil war. But the genie couldn't be put back in the bottle. Copies had already been dispatched to cathedrals and castles, their words copied and recopied like a whispered secret too potent to suppress. Later monarchs, desperate for support, reissued it each time, reinforcing the idea that power came with conditions. The irony, many barons who forced John's hand cared little for grand ideals. They wanted to protect their own privileges. But words, once set loose, take on lives of their own. By the 17th century, parliamentarians battling absolute monarchy wielded the Magna Carta like a sword, proving that ink, when carefully crafted, could outlast crowns. Today, its influence stretches from courtroom oaths to constitutions worldwide, a testament to the enduring might of a document born from rebellion. The lesson: even the mightiest iron bends beneath the weight of well-placed words. Diplomacy in the medieval world often moved at the speed of parchment. While kings raised armies, their scribes crafted something far more potent: treaties that could redraw maps with a stroke of the pen. Take the Treaty of Verdun in 843, where Charlemagne's grandsons divided his empire not through war but around a table. Lothair, Louis, and Charles didn't just split land, they created new kingdoms: East Francia, West Francia, and the fragile Middle Kingdom, each boundary etched in ink. The irony: battles had united the empire, but words carved it apart, proving that diplomacy could dismantle what steel had forged. These documents were masterclasses in precision. A single ambiguous phrase might spark future wars, while a well-placed clause could ensure decades of peace. When King Henry V of England married Catherine of Valois under the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, the agreement didn't just unite two people, it declared their future children heirs to both crowns. That parchment temporarily erased the 100 Years' War's bloodshed, substituting ink for arrows. Yet the treaty's failure to account for shifting loyalties later unraveled its promises, showing how even the most elegant documents couldn't outpace human ambition. Some treaties wielded power through sheer spectacle. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 wasn't signed in one dramatic moment, but through a flurry of documents across cities, each copy reinforcing the others like interlocking shields. By decentralizing the signing, diplomats ensured no single ruler could claim dominance over the process. the message was clear: sovereignty now flowed from consensus, not conquest. But perhaps the most ingenious treaties were those that turned enemies into stakeholders. The Hanseatic League, a network of merchant cities, used written agreements to create something revolutionary, a trade zone where disputes were settled with ledgers, not lances. A merchant in Lubeck could sue a competitor in Bruges based on clauses penned years earlier, their quills proving mightier than any mercenary's sword. These silent conquests reveal a truth medieval warriors learned too late. You could win a battle with brute force, but to hold a kingdom, you needed the unbreakable chains of ink. Treaties didn't just end wars, they built worlds, one carefully chosen word at a time. The bustling ports of medieval Lubeck and Hamburg tell a story of conquest without a single drop of blood spilled. Here, the Hanseatic League, a loose alliance of merchant guilds, rewrote the rules of power. Forget armored knights, their soldiers were scribes hunched over ledgers, their battlefields the crowded market squares of Novgorod and Bruges. With each contract signed, they didn't just move goods, they moved empires. At its peak, the League's network stretched from London to the Baltic, a web of trade routes held together by the brittle strength of parchment. A merchant in Cologne could sell wool to a buyer in Riga, trusting that the terms written months earlier would be honored. No king's decree enforced these deals, just the collective understanding that breaking a Hanseatic contract meant exile from the most lucrative markets in Europe. That was the genius of their system. Wealth became a weapon, and exclusion from trade a fate worse than any siege. Take the contours, their fortified trading posts abroad. These weren't just warehouses but diplomatic enclaves where ink trumped iron. When the League boycotted Norway in the 13th century over unfair tariffs, they didn't send soldiers, they simply closed their contour in Bergen. Within months, Norway's economy sputtered like a candle in the wind. King Magnus had no choice but to capitulate, rewriting his laws to lure the merchants back. The lesson: a well-timed embargo could humble monarchs faster than any army. Their greatest innovation was the Hanseatic letter, a precursor to modern credit. A merchant in Gdansk could promise payment to a supplier in Amsterdam with nothing but a signed note, redeemable at any League outpost. This system turned trust into currency, and parchment into a financial network stretching across borders. Even kings borrowed from their coffers, discovering too late that debt could bind tighter than any vassal's oath. Yet the League's downfall came from the very thing that built it: reliance on the written word. When nation-states rose, crafting their own trade laws, the League's agreements became relics. The irony: the contracts that once made them invincible now rendered them obsolete. But their legacy endures in every modern trade agreement, a reminder that commerce, when wielded with precision, can reshape the world as decisively as any sword. Bologna in the 12th century buzzed with a sound more dangerous than clashing swords: the murmur of scholars debating law in crowded lecture halls. Here, beneath vaulted ceilings, students from across Europe pored over rediscovered Roman legal texts, their discussions quietly eroding the foundations of feudal power. These weren't just classrooms, they were laboratories of rebellion, where the idea that authority should derive from reason, not birthright, took root. A professor's lecture on Justinian's code could unravel centuries of noble privilege with a single syllogism. Paris's left bank became another battleground of ink. Theologians like Peter Abelard turned dialectics, the art of logical argument, into a weapon against dogma. His book Sic et Non, Yes and No, laid out contradictory church teachings side by side, forcing students to wrestle with ambiguity rather than blindly accept tradition. The shockwaves reached Rome when Bernard of Clairvaux accused Abelard of heresy. It wasn't just a personal feud. It was a panic attack over losing control of the narrative. Universities had become places where questions outranked decrees. The real power lay in the textbooks. Unlike royal charters locked in vaults, these manuscripts were copied and carried across borders by wandering scholars. Gratian's Decretum, compiled in Bologna, didn't just organize canon law, it taught generations how to think systematically about justice. A student from England could return home armed with arguments to challenge local lords, his satchel packed with more subversion than any smuggled sword. Even the architecture told the story. Oxford's early colleges were built like fortresses, but their gates opened to anyone who could debate, not just those with titles. A butcher's son mastering Aristotle could outrank a duke's heir in these halls. That was the quiet revolution, meritocracy creeping in through the back door, one disputation at a time. Yet the old powers struck back. When the University of Paris condemned certain Aristotelian ideas in 1277, it wasn't just banning philosophy, it was trying to leash the intellect. But the genie was out of the ink pot. Scholars simply moved debates to private libraries or coded their radical ideas in allegory. The classroom had birthed something irreversible, the notion that truth belonged to those who could argue for it, not just those born to command it. The Church's battle against heresy wasn't fought with torches alone. It was waged in the margins of manuscripts, in the careful strokes of a cleric's pen. When the Cathars of southern France preached a dualist vision of the world, rejecting the Church's authority, Rome didn't just send soldiers. It unleashed a flood of carefully crafted rebuttals, each word a brick in the wall of orthodoxy. Pope Innocent III's letters didn't merely condemn, they framed heresy as a contagion, painting dissenters as threats to the very soul of Christendom. A single papal bull could turn neighbors into informants, their loyalty secured not by force, but by the persuasive power of the written word. These texts were masterclasses in psychological warfare. Take the Summa Contra Hereticos treatises written by theologians like Alan of Lille, which dissected heresies with surgical precision. They didn't just shout down opposing ideas, they dismantled them logically, line by line, leaving no room for doubt. A peasant hearing these arguments read aloud in the village square might never grasp Latin subtleties, but the message was clear. The Church's truth was unassailable, its authority woven into the very fabric of Scripture. Yet the most potent weapon wasn't refutation, it was replacement. Monasteries churned out approved texts by the thousands, flooding regions where heresy had taken root. A beautifully illuminated Bible or a lavishly copied saint's life wasn't just a book, it was a visual and tactile argument for orthodoxy. The sheer weight of these volumes, their gold leaf, their vibrant pigment screamed legitimacy in a way no fiery sermon could. If heresy thrived in whispers, the Church answered with a thunderous chorus of ink. But the struggle had its ironies. To combat heresy, the Church sometimes borrowed its tactics. When Franciscan friars debated radical poverty, their pamphlets circulated like underground manifestos, blurring the line between orthodoxy and rebellion. Even the Albigensian Crusade, for all its violence, relied on written propaganda to justify its atrocities. Letters describing alleged heretic crimes were read from pulpits, turning distant battles into moral emergencies. The lesson in the war for minds, the pen could be as ruthless as the sword, and far more precise. By the time the Inquisition formalized its courts, the template was set. Confessions were meticulously recorded, charges drawn up in triplicate. A heretic's fate might hinge on a single phrase in a notary's transcript. The written record didn't just punish, it erased, rewriting history to ensure dissent left no trace. Yet even here cracks appeared. Some scribes, perhaps moved by conscience, softened testimonies or lost damning documents. Others, like the Beguines mystic women who circulated their own devotional texts, proved that ink, once spilled, could never be fully controlled. The Church's greatest fear wasn't heresy itself, but the realization that words, once set free, might outlast even the mightiest institutions. For centuries, words had been shackled by the slow labor of scribes, each manuscript a precious rarity, copied by hand at the pace of a monk's weary fingers. Then, in the foggy Rhine valley of the 1400s, Johannes Gutenberg unleashed a storm. His printing press didn't just speed up book-making, it shattered the very economics of knowledge. Imagine a world where a single pamphlet, cranked out by the hundreds in a day, could sway public opinion faster than a king's decree. Overnight, the balance of power tilted. Where once a monarch might burn a heretic's handwritten tract, now the same ideas could flood cities like a tide, slipping past gatekeepers and censors with ease. The press's first targets were predictable: Bibles. Gutenberg's 42-line edition wasn't just a book, it was a revolution bound in vellum. Suddenly, scripture wasn't locked behind Latin and priestly interpretation. A merchant in Antwerp or a farmer in Saxony could, if they dared, read the text themselves, drawing their own conclusions. This wasn't just about religion, it was about authority. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in 1517, it wasn't the act itself that shook Europe. It was the fact that printers across Germany reproduced his arguments like wildfire, spreading dissent faster than the church could extinguish it. Governments scrambled to respond. In England, Henry VIII's licensing laws tried to muzzle the press by limiting who could own one, a desperate bid to control the genie let loose. But bans backfired. Underground printers flourished, their illicit presses humming in cellars and attics. A single smuggled volume of Tyndale's English New Testament could seed rebellion in a dozen towns, proving that ideas once mass-produced became impossible to recall. The press also rewrote warfare. Battlefield dispatches, once confined to royal courts, now reached coffeehouses and taverns. During the 30 Years' War, broadsheets turned distant conflicts into visceral tragedies, rallying support or condemnation with woodcut illustrations of burning villages. A soldier's letter home, reprinted and circulated, could erode morale more effectively than any enemy charge. Yet the most profound change was invisible: the standardization of thought. Before the press, no two copies of a text were identical. Scribble errors and regional dialects splintered knowledge into fragments. Now, a Parisian scholar and a Venetian merchant could debate from the same page, their arguments anchored to a shared textual reality. The very concept of facts hardened into something reproducible, debatable, and for those in power, dangerous. Gutenberg's invention didn't just spread ideas, it multiplied their consequences. A single radical treatise copied 10,000 times could topple thrones. The press was the final proof of ink's supremacy, a machine that turned words into armies and readers into revolutionaries. Long before courtrooms had gavels or law schools had diplomas, justice often came at the tip of a sword, swift, brutal, and utterly unpredictable. But in the 6th century, Emperor Justinian of Byzantium rewrote the rules. His Corpus Juris Civilis wasn't just a legal text, it was a declaration that order could be carved into parchment rather than enforced through bloodshed. For the first time, crimes had fixed punishments, contracts had enforceable terms, and even emperors were theoretically bound by their own laws. Imagine the shock of a Frankish warlord, used to settling disputes by strength alone, confronting a Byzantine judge who dared say, "The code disagrees." This shift from oral custom to written law didn't just change courts, it redefined power itself. Take the Sachsenspiegel, a 13th century German legal code that meticulously outlined everything from property disputes to the proper width of bridle paths. Suddenly, a peasant could challenge a lord's arbitrary fine by pointing to a line in a book. The message was clear. Authority no longer flowed solely from the edge of a blade, but from the legitimacy of the written word. Legal scholars, once overshadowed by knights, now held the keys to kingdoms. A well-trained jurist in Bologna could dismantle a noble's claim with a citation, proving that a library could be as formidable as any armory. Yet these codes had their own cunning flexibility. The Normans, after conquering England in 1066, kept Anglo-Saxon laws intact, but only on parchment. By maintaining the illusion of continuity while subtly inserting Norman priorities, William the Conqueror proved that legal texts could be both shield and sword. His Domesday book wasn't just a tax record. It was a masterstroke of psychological control, forcing every landholder to admit in writing exactly what they owed the crown. Resistance became not just treason, but a violation of documented truth. The real revolution, though, lay in accessibility. Towns like Lübeck and Magdeburg began publishing law books in the vernacular, not just Latin. A merchant who'd never set foot in a university could now quote municipal statutes to defend his market stall. When the Libro de los Fueros codified Aragonese customs in the 13th century, it didn't just standardize justice, it gave commoners a weapon against noble whims. But perhaps no legal document carried more symbolic weight than the Golden Bull of 1356, which formalized the election of Holy Roman Emperors. 7 electors, their rolls etched in ink, could now defy the mightiest warlord by citing a parchment older than his dynasty. The bull's clauses turned political theater into constitutional fact, proving that even the highest offices could be bound by words. The irony, many of these codes were drafted to consolidate power, yet they inevitably planted seeds of accountability. When English barons forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, they weren't just airing grievances, they were invoking a principle older than Justinian, that no ruler, no matter how divinely anointed, stands above the law. The Quill, it turned out, could humble crowns as surely as any rebellion. Consider the Bayeux Tapestry, not a chronicle in words, but in thread. This 70-meter-long embroidery didn't just depict William the Conqueror's invasion of England, it spun raw conquest into divine destiny. Every stitch whispered propaganda, Harold's broken oath, the comet heralding his doom, William's coronation framed as God's will. Here was history as theater, where needles and ink shared the same goal, to make the victor's version stick. Official court chroniclers wielded even subtler tools. Take Matthew Paris, a Benedictine monk whose Chronica Majora mixed gossip, miracles, and royal scandals with straight-faced authority. When he described King Henry III's failed campaigns, he didn't just report losses, he framed them as tests of faith, turning military blunders into spiritual lessons. A king might rage at defeat, but if the chronicle painted him as a pious sufferer, his reputation could emerge untarnished. The most audacious rewrites happened after revolutions. When Henry VII seized England's throne in 1485, his scribes went to work erasing the previous dynasty. Richard III, once a competent administrator, became a hunchbacked villain in Tudor chronicles, his reign twisted into a melodrama of murder and tyranny. Shakespeare later cemented this caricature, proving how ink could assassinate a reputation more thoroughly than any sword. But chroniclers weren't just royal puppets, they played a dangerous game. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled in monasteries far from court, preserved unflattering truths like Viking raids and famines, often in terse entries that spoke volumes. Here in this year, nothing happened but despair. These unofficial records became time capsules of dissent, proving that not all quills bowed to power. The real power of these texts lay in their longevity. A king's decree might fade, but a well-circulated chronicle became immutable truth. when Charlemagne's courtiers labeled Pope Leo III as morally unfit, their accusations outlived the Pope's rebuttals by centuries. The lesson was clear: control the narrative, and you controlled history itself, not just for your lifetime, but for generations unborn. The winter of 1077 wasn't just cold, it was humiliating. Emperor Henry IV stood barefoot in the snow outside Canossa Castle, wrapped in sackcloth, begging Pope Gregory VII for forgiveness. No swords were drawn, no castle stormed, yet this moment marked one of history's most shocking power shifts. The investiture controversy, a decades-long battle over who could appoint bishops, wasn't settled on a battlefield but through parchment and pen, Gregory's weapon. A decree called Dictatus Papae, 27 explosive statements declaring the Pope's supremacy over emperors. Each line was a grenade tossed at feudal tradition, asserting that only the Church could grant spiritual authority, meaning kings no longer controlled their own clergy. Henry's response showed how seriously he took this paper war. When Gregory excommunicated him, it wasn't just a spiritual penalty, it was political dynamite. Excommunication meant Henry's vassals no longer owed him allegiance, turning every castle into a potential rebellion. The emperor's desperate journey to Canossa, his 3-day wait outside the gates, wasn't about piety, it was a tactical retreat. By kneeling, Henry bought time to regroup, but the precedent was set. A pope could topple an emperor with ink and wax, yet the real genius of Gregory's strategy lay in his letters. Unlike battle cries heard only by nearby soldiers, his missives crisscrossed Europe, read aloud in cathedrals from Paris to Prague. Each one framed Henry as a tyrant violating divine order, while Gregory positioned himself as Christendom's defender. This wasn't just spin, it was medieval information warfare. Even Henry's counter-propaganda, like his letter accusing Gregory of overreach, backfired when the Pope's scribes edited it to sound even more arrogant before recopying it for mass distribution. The controversy's resolution, the Concordat of Worms in 1122, was a masterclass in diplomatic finesse. On paper, it split the difference. Emperors could invest bishops with secular lands, but only popes granted spiritual authority. In practice, it was a papal victory. By separating the roles, the Church ensured bishops would prioritize Rome over royal patrons. Future emperors found their power clipped, their influence over local churches evaporating like mist. What made this clash revolutionary wasn't just the outcome, but the battlefield. When Gregory and Henry dueled, their weapons were seals and scribes, their arena the written word. They proved that in the medieval world, the mightiest throne could be toppled not by siege engines, but by sentences. A lord's promise to protect his vassal meant little without parchment to back it up. In the flickering torchlight of a castle's scriptorium, scribes transformed spoken oaths into ironclad contracts, documents that spelled out exactly how many nights a vassal owed, how many days of labor his peasants must provide, even the quality of grain expected as tribute. What began as a handshake between warriors became a ledger entry, binding generations to terms their ancestors had inked. The feudal system, often romanticized as a pyramid of honor and loyalty, functioned more like a meticulously kept accounting book where every obligation had a paper trail. Take the Libri Feudalorum, compiled in 12th century Lombardy. This wasn't just a legal text, it was a master list of feudal contracts that standardized relationships across northern Italy. A vassal in Milan could now point to Clause 37 to prove his military service capped at 40 days a year, while a lord in Venice might invoke Clause 12 to demand lodging rights during his travels. Suddenly, the vagueness of loyalty had teeth, enforceable in courts where parchment outweighed personal charisma. Even disputes over something as mundane as a damaged plow could be settled by referencing a contract signed decades earlier. proving that feudalism's real glue wasn't chivalry but bureaucracy. Yet these contracts had loopholes sharper than a knight's dagger. When King John of England demanded excessive scutage payments, a fee vassals paid to avoid military service, his barons didn't just grumble. They brandished their charters, arguing that custom now written down limited the king's demands. The Magna Carta's famous clauses didn't emerge from thin air. They were cobbled together from decades of forgotten contracts, each one a small rebellion against overreach. A vassal's best defense against a greedy lord wasn't his sword arm, but his archive. The irony, many contracts were drafted to prevent exactly the chaos they later caused. When William the Conqueror parceled out English lands to his Norman vassals, the agreement seemed straightforward. But as heirs squabbled over interpretations, the Domesday book became a battleground. A phrase like, "and his heirs forever," could spark wars when two cousins claimed the same fief, each waving competing parchments. Legalistic nitpicking turned deadly, proof that ink could ignite conflicts as easily as it resolved them. By the 14th century, feudalism's paper chains began to rust. As money economies grew, a vassal might buy out his military obligations with cash, rendering old contracts obsolete. Towns secured charters freeing them from feudal dues, while clever lawyers reinterpreted centuries-old clauses to suit new realities. The system didn't collapse, it was slowly dismantled clause by clause, its foundations eroded not by rebellion but by receipts. The lesson: even the mightiest hierarchies crumble when the words that built them lose their meaning. Elena of Aquitaine's seal didn't just mark documents, it shattered expectations. When this twice-crowned queen negotiated the release of her son Richard the Lionheart, she didn't send a knight with a sword. She dispatched a clerk with parchment, her personal seal dangling like a silent threat. That crimson wax carried more authority than any armed escort, proof that in the high-stakes game of medieval politics, a woman's signature could be as formidable as a garrison. Her court at Poitiers became a hub of poetic patronage and legal innovation, where troubadours sang of courtly love while scribes drafted charters that redefined power dynamics across Europe. Then there's Matilda of Tuscany, the warrior countess who turned her castle at Canossa into a papal fortress during the investiture controversy. While chroniclers obsessed over Emperor Henry's barefoot penance, Matilda's scribes were busy crafting the paperwork that made it possible. Her charters didn't just grant land to the church, they strategically positioned her as the gatekeeper between empire and papacy. A single clause pledging military support to Pope Gregory could alter the balance of power more decisively than any battlefield charge. These women mastered the art of the hidden hand. Take the correspondence of Hildegard of Bingen, whose visionary letters to emperors and popes blended mystical authority with razor-sharp diplomacy. When she admonished Frederick Barbarossa for schism, she didn't frame it as rebellion, but as divine counsel wrapped in elegant Latin. Her ink carried the weight of heaven itself, leaving recipients unable to dismiss her as just another meddling nun. Even widows leveraged parchment to protect their autonomy. Blanche of Castile, ruling France as regent for young Louis IX, issued ordinances under her own seal during crises. A bold move that male advisors grudgingly accepted because her documents were flawless. Every phrase echoed legal precedent, every signature placed with precision. She proved that widowhood, often seen as vulnerability, could become a weapon when paired with administrative savvy. The real surprise lies in the margins. In monastery archives, you'll find charters where abbesses presided over land disputes between knights, their judgments inscribed as law. Town records show merchant widows like Daus of Provence dictating contracts that rivaled any guild masters. These weren't exceptions. they were part of a quiet revolution where women exploited the era's most potent currency, written proof. A well-drafted will could safeguard a daughter's inheritance against rapacious uncles. A carefully worded marriage contract might reserve control of property that everyone assumed would default to the husband. Their legacy lingers in the parchment cracks of history, not as anomalies but as tacticians who understood the true battlefield. While swords settled skirmishes, ink shaped centuries. And in that arena, the sharpest quills often belonged to hands society insisted should only wield needles. While castles crumbled and Europe's monasteries guarded their precious few books, the real intellectual fireworks were happening elsewhere in the bustling libraries of Cordoba, Baghdad, and Toledo. Here, Jewish and Islamic scholars didn't just preserve ancient knowledge, they supercharged it, turning parchment into a time machine that carried Aristotle's logic, Hippocrates' medicine, and Ptolemy's astronomy safely into the future. Take the House of Wisdom in 9th century Baghdad, where Caliph Al-Ma'mun paid translators their weight in gold to render Greek texts into Arabic. A single manuscript of Euclid's geometry, once destined to rot in some forgotten Byzantine cellar, now became the foundation for breakthroughs in optics and algebra. These weren't mere copyists, they were innovators, annotating margins with corrections that would later stun European scholars. Medicine offers one of the clearest examples of this ink-powered revolution. While European doctors still bled patients to balance humors, Jewish physicians like Maimonides in 12th century Cairo wrote treatises linking cleanliness to health, a radical idea at the time. His medical texts, translated into Latin, became required reading at Montpellier and Salerno, the Harvard and Yale of medieval Europe. Meanwhile, in Islamic Spain, surgeons like al-Zahrawi illustrated intricate surgical tools in manuscripts so precise they remained standard references for 500 years. A single diagram of his forceps could save more lives than a battalion of crusading knights. Legal scholarship thrived too. Islamic jurists compiled vast encyclopedias of case law, while Jewish rabbis in places like Sura and Pumbedita debated Talmudic interpretations across generations, their rulings copied and circulated like legal wikis. When a merchant in Alexandria needed to resolve a contract dispute or a farmer in Provence sought guidance on crop rotation, they often turned not to local lords, but to handwritten responsa from scholars hundreds of miles away. The ink flowing between these centers of learning created something unprecedented, a transnational rulebook that functioned without emperors or armies to enforce it. The real magic happened at the borders between worlds. In Toledo after the Christian reconquest, a polyglot army of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian translators worked side by side, turning Arabic texts into Latin via Hebrew bridges. A clerk might start his morning translating Avicenna's medical canon from Arabic to Spanish, then spend his afternoon rendering it from Spanish to Latin. These weren't just word-for-word conversions, they were intellectual alchemy, with translators adding footnotes comparing Greek, Persian, and Indian theories. By the time Thomas Aquinas got his hands on these texts, they'd been refined through more cultures than a spice caravan's cargo. Yet for all their brilliance, these scholars faced an ironic twist. As their works flooded into Europe via Italy and Sicily, fueling the Renaissance, many of the original manuscripts were lost in their homelands to wars and purges. The very knowledge that had leaped borders in peacetime now depended on European monks to preserve it. A bittersweet reminder that ink, unlike empires, owes no allegiance to crowns. The takeaway: while kings fought over patches of dirt, these scribes were building something far more enduring, a shared inheritance of ideas, written in languages that outlasted the kingdoms that once spurned them. The year 1348 dawned with a peculiar silence across Europe, not just the quiet of emptied streets, but the eerie absence of scratching quills. As the Black Death swept from port cities to rural hamlets, it didn't just claim lives, it obliterated the very systems that held society together. Town clerks who once meticulously recorded births, deaths, and taxes now lay in mass graves. Monasteries that served as regional archives became charnel houses, their inkwells dried beside dead scribes. Suddenly, the intricate web of contracts, court rolls, and tax ledgers, the invisible threads that had tamed feudal chaos, began unraveling. A lord might still brandish his sword, but without scribes to document harvest yields or courts to enforce debts, his power shriveled like parchment in flame. Consider the chaos in England's manorial courts. Before the plague, these tribunals operated with bureaucratic precision. Fines for stolen livestock recorded down to the last penny, labor obligations tallied in neat columns. But as scribes perished, entire villages found themselves in legal limbo. A serf might claim his family had worked the same plot for generations, but with no written proof, opportunistic lords could rewrite history overnight. The Domesday Book, once the ultimate authority on landholdings, suddenly had gaps no living memory could fill. Even kings weren't immune. When Edward III tried to collect wartime taxes from decimated towns, his collectors found empty offices and lost records. The treasury's ledgers, usually bursting with entries, showed alarming blank pages where thriving markets had once been. The church faced its own documentary crisis. For centuries, wills bequeathing land to monasteries had been its financial lifeblood, but with notaries dead, last wishes went unrecorded, leaving heirs to contest donations. At Avignon, Pope Clement VI's clerks scrambled to reconstruct lost tithe records, their once omniscient archives now full of ghostly omissions. In some regions, entire dioceses ceased keeping records for years, a silence more terrifying than any heresy, for it meant the church's grip on daily life had slipped. Yet from this collapse emerged an unexpected revolution. Survivors discovered that old rules, literally unwritten, could be rewritten. Peasants who'd once owed 3 days' labor per week found lords too desperate for workers to enforce tradition. Guilds, their membership rolls halved, began accepting apprentices without the usual fees, informal changes that later hardened into new charters. Even language itself shifted as educated clerks died. In England, Latin gave way to Middle English in legal documents, a small but seismic democratization of the written word. The plague's aftermath proved a brutal lesson. Swords could enforce order temporarily, but only ink could sustain it. When governments eventually rebuilt their bureaucracies, they did so with obsessive redundancy, duplicate record-keeping, centralized archives, even early experiments in public notaries. The trauma of losing written memory birthed systems designed to outlast any future calamity. The Black Death hadn't just killed people, it had killed certainty, leaving survivors to rebuild a world where every scrap of parchment became a bulwark against chaos. Florence in the 1400s smelled of ink and ambition. While rival city-states wasted fortunes on mercenaries, the Medici family built an empire with something far more lethal, a double-entry ledger. This wasn't just bookkeeping, it was financial alchemy. Every florin lent to a duke, every bale of wool sold on credit, every interest payment discreetly recorded. These entries became chains stronger than any prison iron. A king might default on his debts, but the Medici's meticulously kept books meant he'd never borrow another coin until he settled. Their power didn't come from vaults of gold, but from the unassailable truth of handwritten numbers. Consider how they operated. When Pope John XXIII needed funds for his ill-fated crusade, he didn't ransack churches, he sent envoys to Florence. The Medici advanced him the money not out of piety, but because their ledger gave them leverage no army could match. If the Pope delayed repayment, they could freeze his accounts across Europe, leaving him unable to pay soldiers or bribe cardinals. Their network of branch banks from Bruges to Jerusalem functioned like a medieval SWIFT system, transferring wealth with handwritten bills of exchange. A merchant in Venice could deposit gold and receive a coded note redeemable in London, all without a single coin risking bandits on the road. The real genius lay in their discretion. Officially, the church forbade usury, so the Medici disguised interest as exchange fees or gifts. Their account books, written in cryptic shorthand, balanced spiritual appearances with earthly profits. A loan to King Edward IV of England might appear as a commercial investment in wool exports, with risk carefully calculated across multiple ledgers. They weren't just bankers, they were narrative architects crafting financial stories that satisfied both kings and confessors. But their greatest innovation was political. By financing both sides in conflicts, the Yorkists and Lancastrians in England, the Sforzas and Viscontis in Milan, they ensured profit regardless of who won. Their ledger became a chessboard where wars were won not with swords, but with calculated debits. When Lorenzo the Magnificent needed to quash a rival family, he didn't send assassins, he called in their debts, collapsing their credit like a house of cards. Yet even the Medici system had vulnerabilities. The Pazzi conspiracy, their infamous near downfall, began when rivals realized the family's power rested on perception. A single bad debt could spark panic among depositors. Their eventual decline came not from military defeat, but from careless loans to monarchs who treated repayment as optional. The lesson was clear: ink could build empires, but only if the hands wielding it never forgot that parchment, for all its power, was still just parchment. The Albigensian Crusade began not with a battle cry, but with a pen stroke, the papal bull Excommunicamus of 1208, in which Pope Innocent III declared the Cathars of southern France worse than Saracens. This wasn't just condemnation, it was bureaucratic annihilation. Every heretic burned at Montségur had first been sentenced in writing, their names etched into inquisitorial ledgers long before the pyres were lit. The Church understood that to erase a people, you had to erase their story, and parchment proved far more efficient than fire for rewriting history. Consider the chilling precision of these records. Dominican friars like Bernard Gouy didn't merely interrogate suspects. They compiled manual step-by-step guides for identifying heresy, complete with sample questions and expected answers. A peasant's nervous glance or a merchant's hesitation over the Eucharist could become damning evidence when transcribed onto parchment. These weren't transcripts, they were scripts for a predetermined drama where the accused always confessed, always implicated others, and always confirmed the Church's narrative of a cancerous heresy spreading through Christendom. The real violence lay in the paperwork's permanence. While a sword stroke might kill one man, a single notarized confession could doom generations. When entire villages were listed as infected in diocesan registers, their descendants faced bans from marriage, inheritance, or trade for decades. Even the dead weren't safe. Graves were exhumed and bones burned based on decades-old marginal notes about suspected Cathar sympathies. The message was clear: heresy wasn't just a sin, it was a stain no time could wash away, preserved forever in ink. Yet the Church's obsession with documentation betrayed an unexpected weakness. To justify the Crusade's atrocities, scribes had to record them. When legates wrote of thousands slaughtered at Béziers, "Kill them all, God will know his own," they accidentally preserved the Cathars' martyrdom. For every page labeling them as deviants, another inadvertently revealed their courage. a heretic refusing to recant even as flames licked his feet, a perfecter Cathar spiritual leader whispering blessings to her executioners. The very records meant to erase them became their unwitting memorials. The Crusade's aftermath exposed parchment's double edge. As Dominicans methodically destroyed Cathar texts, they inadvertently created a paper trail proving the movement's sophistication. Burned fragments of the Book of the Two Principles survived in trial records, their dualist philosophy preserved by the Church's own clerks. In trying to silence the Cathars, their persecutors became their unintended archivists. The final irony: today, historians piecing together Cathar beliefs rely not on their lost libraries, but on the meticulous hatred of the inquisitors who sought to obliterate them. The legend of King Arthur begins not with a sword in a stone, but with a quill on parchment, a carefully crafted fiction designed to reshape reality. When Geoffrey of Monmouth penned Historia Regum Britanniae in the 12th century, he wasn't recording history, he was inventing it. His tales of Camelot, Excalibur, and the Round Table didn't just entertain, they served as a blueprint for aristocratic behavior, a glittering mirror held up to restless nobles. The message was clear: true power wasn't seized through brute force, but earned through piety, loyalty, and courtly grace, qualities only the elite could afford to cultivate. Chivalric romances like the Song of Roland took this further, turning battlefield slaughter into sacred theater. Roland's doomed stand at Roncesvalles Pass wasn't just a hero's death, it was a sermon in verse. By framing his sacrifice as divinely ordained, the poem transformed blind obedience into virtue. Knights listening to troubadours recite these lines didn't hear adventure, they heard job descriptions. The Church and Crown conspired in this literary alchemy, commissioning manuscripts that equated feudal service with spiritual duty. A lord could now demand loyalty by invoking Roland's example, while a monk could justify crusades by quoting Lancelot's piety. Yet the real genius lay in the story's flexibility. Arthur's court could be whatever the patron needed: a cautionary tale about divided loyalty for rebellious barons, or a model of unity for squabbling kings. When Helena of Aquitaine sponsored Création de Troyes romances, she wasn't just indulging in fantasy, she was codifying the rules of courtly love to elevate women's influence. Suddenly, a noblewoman's favor became as crucial to a knight's reputation as his sword arm, shifting power dynamics in castle halls, the darker truth. These stories were weapons of exclusion. Peasants who couldn't read Latin or Old French were locked out of the chivalric ideal, their labor fueling the very system that romanticized their oppression. When Gawain gallantly refused to eat until a host offered food, no one mentioned the serfs who starved to harvest his banquet. The parchment aristocracy had created a myth so seductive, even those it crushed admired its glow. By the 15th century, the gap between fiction and reality yawned wide. Knights in rusted armor clanking through muddy villages still dreamed of Grail quests, while mercenaries with no use for chivalry dominated real battlefields. The final irony: the printing press, which mass-produced these tales, also exposed their artifice. As literacy spread, readers began questioning why Roland's noble sacrifice felt less heroic when their own lords demanded similar obedience without the poetry. The sword of legend had been outshone by its own reflection, a glittering lie written in ink. The 100 Years' War wasn't just fought with longbows and cannons, it was waged in the margins of treaties, the fine print of truces, and the wax seals of royal proclamations. For every battlefield like Agincourt or Crécy, there were a dozen clandestine meetings where scribes drafted terms that would redirect armies or bankrupt kingdoms. Take the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, a document so precise it redrew the map of France without a single arrow loosed. Edward III of England, victorious at Poitiers, didn't just demand land. He insisted on clauses specifying exactly which castles, toll roads, and fishing rights came with Aquitaine. The French, desperate to free their captured king, signed away territories worth millions only to later exploit loopholes in the Latin phrasing to reclaim them. Diplomatic ink flowed even in wartime's darkest hours. The Truce of Lullingham in 1389 paused hostilities for decades, not out of goodwill, but because both sides were drowning in debt. The parchment signed that day didn't just halt battles, it froze economies. English wool merchants, barred from Flemish markets, watched their warehouses rot while French nobles, unable to ransom prisoners, pawned their titles to Italian bankers. Yet the truce's real power lay in its ambiguity. By leaving key issues unresolved, like the thorny question of sovereignty over Gascony, it ensured the war would reignite the moment either side regained strength. Royal claims themselves were battles of paperwork. Henry V's invasion in 1415 hinged on a 60-year-old treaty, the Treaty of Troyes, which he brandished like a legal brief. Its terms, declaring English kings heirs to France, were dubious at best, but Henry understood the theater of legitimacy. His scribes produced illuminated copies to display in conquered towns, turning dry Latin clauses into propaganda. Meanwhile, across the Channel, French clerks combed through archives for counterarguments, unearthing ancient Salic law texts to prove no woman, and thus no descendant through a female line like Edward III, could inherit the French crown. The war's final twist came not on a battlefield but in a notary's ledger. When Joan of Arc rallied French forces in 1429, her victories breathed life into a dying cause, yet it was the bureaucratic aftermath that sealed England's fate. The Treaty of Arras in 1435 didn't just end Burgundy's alliance with England. It meticulously listed every piece of silver, every barrel of wine, and every square mile of land that would buy Duke Philip's loyalty. The English, now isolated, found their own records working against them. Decades of occupied territories had generated mountains of administrative documents, tax rolls, garrison reports, supply lists that the French now used to systematically dismantle their holdings. A clerk's notation about a poorly stocked armory could doom a castle faster than any siege. By the war's end in 1453, the lesson was clear. You could win 1,000 battles and still lose a kingdom if you neglected the paper trail. The French crown's meticulous archives, its treaties cross-referenced, its claims notarized, its victories enshrined in chronicles, outlasted England's fleeting battlefield glory. The real victor wasn't the side with the better generals, but the one with the sharper quills. In the shadows of medieval courts, where whispers could topple kingdoms, spies carried a weapon far subtler than daggers, the carefully crafted letter. Take the case of the Breton knight Bertrand de Born, who smuggled coded messages to Elena of Aquitaine during her son's rebellion against Henry II. His letters, disguised as innocent poetry, hid treasonous plots in acrostics, the first letters of each line spelling out troop movements. When intercepted, they appeared harmless. To the initiated, they were battle plans in plain sight. This wasn't just subterfuge, it was linguistic alchemy, turning ink into a delivery system for revolution. Forgery elevated espionage to an art form. During the Wars of the Roses, Yorkist agents fabricated a genealogy, proving Henry VI's lineage was illegitimate, their parchment aged with tea stains and carefully replicated seals. The document's power lay not in its authenticity, but in its plausibility, enough to sway undecided nobles and fracture Lancastrian alliances. Even the Church wasn't immune. Papal bulls, those sacred decrees stamped with the fisherman's ring, were so frequently counterfeited that popes began embedding secret markings, a cross-hatched P, in the margin or a specific wax blend to outwit the forgers. Some spies turned writing itself into a weapon. The Byzantines pioneered sympathetic ink, using lemon juice or milk to pen invisible messages that only appeared when heated. A merchant's bland inventory list might conceal the locations of Ottoman troop deployments once held over a candle. More audacious were the Venetian double agents who wrote between the lines literally. Their dispatches used two inks, black for harmless gossip, then a lighter sepia overwritten with sensitive details. Rubbed with a special solution, the top layer dissolved, revealing secrets beneath. The stakes were existential. When the Duke of Burgundy's spies intercepted a letter from Louis XI promising Swiss mercenaries double pay to switch sides, they didn't just read it, they edited it. By altering key figures and resealing the document, they turned the offer into an insult, ensuring the Swiss would fight for Burgundy out of spite. The original was burned, the forged version became history. Yet the greatest power of these documents lay in their ambiguity. A well-placed fake could sow chaos without a single death. Planted letters exposing a lord's betrayal might take months to disprove, time enough for his allies to abandon him. Unlike a sword stroke which left clear culprits, forged ink created mazes of doubt where truth became whatever the best scribe could convincingly replicate. In the end, the most feared spies weren't those who stole secrets, but those who manufactured them, understanding that in the medieval world, perception often outweighed reality, especially when meticulously notarized. The sack of Constantinople in 1453 didn't just topple an empire, it erased a millennium of knowledge in a single fiery night. As Ottoman soldiers surged through the streets, their torches lit more than just buildings. They ignited the greatest library of the medieval world. The flames that consumed the imperial library of Constantinople weren't merely destroying parchment and ink. They were devouring the last intact threads tying Europe to ancient Greece and Rome. Scholars estimate over 100,000 volumes vanished in the smoke, from Aristotle's lost dialogues to irreplaceable medical texts by Galen. Maimed the Conqueror, despite his later patronage of learning, couldn't stop the chaos. For all his military genius, even he couldn't resurrect scrolls reduced to ash. The tragedy wasn't just in the scale of loss, but in its selectivity. Soldiers who spared churches and mosques showed no such mercy to books. Why? Because they understood, as did the Byzantines, that ideas were more dangerous than icons. A single surviving manuscript could inspire rebellions, preserve heresies, or keep alive philosophies that undermined Ottoman rule. The library's Greek custodians had spent centuries painstakingly copying and annotating texts, creating a living chain back to antiquity. Now that chain snapped. Imagine the despair of scholars like Cardinal Bessarion, who'd spent years smuggling manuscripts to Italy, watching helplessly as centuries of accumulated wisdom burned while the city's walls crumbled. Yet the fire also revealed knowledge's stubborn resilience. Some texts survived because they'd already fled west, hidden in the luggage of refugees or secreted aboard Venetian galleys. Others endured through sheer luck, like the precious codices rescued by monks who braved the flames to save what they could. The Vatican Library's Greek collections owe their existence to these last-minute heroics. Even the Ottomans, once the frenzy subsided, preserved what remained. Maimed appointed Greek scholars to salvage surviving works, recognizing their value even as his troops had destroyed them. The fall of Constantinople became a cautionary tale for the Renaissance. Humanists like Petrarch had long warned that civilization hung by the thread of fragile manuscripts. Now their nightmares had materialized. The disaster sparked a frantic scramble across Europe to copy and disperse remaining texts. printing presses, still a novelty in Germany, suddenly became existential necessities. What couldn't be saved in Constantinople might yet be preserved in duplicate, triplicate, 1,000-fold. The irony, the Ottomans, who'd burned so much, later became custodians of the very knowledge they'd sought to erase, their own scholars poring over rescued Greek texts in Topkapi's Scriptoriums. In the end, the fire birthed as much as it destroyed. The diaspora of Byzantine scholars westward supercharged the Italian Renaissance, their rescued books fueling revolutions in art, science, and philosophy. What Constantinople lost, Florence and Venice gained, but the lesson lingered like smoke in the air. Knowledge, once gone, can never truly be recovered. Every burned book is a world extinguished, a reminder that the greatest casualties of war aren't always counted in bodies, but in the silent vanishing of ideas that might have changed everything. Florence's bustling streets in the 1400s hummed with more than commerce, they crackled with intellectual rebellion. In dimly lit workshops, scholars hunched over manuscripts so ancient their vellum crumbled at the touch, laboring to decipher Greek and Latin texts unseen in Europe for 1,000 years. This wasn't just academic curiosity, it was an insurrection staged one word at a time. Petrarch, often called the father of humanism, didn't simply admire Cicero's letters, he mimicked their style in scathing critiques of church corruption, proving that resurrected rhetoric could dismantle medieval orthodoxy. His discovery of Livy's lost histories in a monastery attic wasn't luck, it was a quiet detonation in the foundations of knowledge. The printing press supercharged this revolution, but the real weapon was the pen's precision. When Lorenzo Valla exposed the donation of Constantine as an 8th century forgery, his proof lay in linguistic minutiae. The document's Latin contained phrases unknown in Constantine's era. A single grammatical analysis unraveled the papacy's claim to secular power, demonstrating that philology could topple empires. Erasmus took this further, weaponizing satire. His praise of folly mocked clergy and scholars alike, its wit so sharp it slipped past censors to become Europe's first viral bestseller. These humanists weren't just translators, they were saboteurs, smuggling radical ideas into commentaries and footnotes where authorities might overlook them. The Church's reaction revealed its terror of unfiltered texts. Indexes of banned books proliferated, yet demand only grew. Wealthy patrons like Cosimo de' Medici financed secret scriptoriums where scribes copied heretical works under the guise of preserving classics. In Venice, printers hid radical tracts inside harmless bindings. A Plato dialogue might conceal Machiavelli's prints sewn into its spine. The Venetian Inquisition's frantic raids on print shops proved their panic. Ink, once controlled by monastic gatekeepers, now flowed like a river breaching its dam. Yet the movement's true triumph was pedagogical. Humanist schools like Vittorino da Feltra's Casa Giocosa replaced rote memorization with Socratic debate. Students didn't just read Virgil, they interrogated his themes on justice and power, applying them to contemporary politics. A merchant's son analyzing Tacitus might start questioning why his city's ruler lacked accountability. This was the silent coup, education molding citizens who saw antiquity not as a dead past, but as a mirror for critiquing the present. The irony, many humanists sought only to purify Christianity, not destroy it. Reuchlin's Hebrew studies aimed to better understand Scripture, yet his defense of Jewish texts against burning enraged Dominicans who saw linguistic diversity as heresy. Even Erasmus, who rejected Luther's extremism, found his works banned by the very church he hoped to reform. The genie of critical thinking, once uncorked, couldn't be forced back into the bottle. By the 16th century, the ripple effects were unstoppable. Copernicus, educated on rediscovered Greek astronomy, dared reposition the cosmos. Vesalius, poring over Galen's errors in cadavers, redrew the human body. The Renaissance's legacy wasn't just prettier paintings. It was the conviction that truth lived in questioning, not blind obedience. The quill had outmaneuvered the sword once more, proving that the most dangerous rebellions begin not with barricades, but with a scholar's marginal note whispering, "This doesn't make sense." Look at any modern constitution, the American, the French, even the Magna Carta inspired clauses in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and you'll find medieval fingerprints all over them. The concept that rulers must obey their own laws didn't spring from Enlightenment philosophers alone. It was forged in the Inkai crucible of 13th century England, where barons forced King John to acknowledge that even crowns had limits. Those same principles now echo in courtrooms worldwide, where a judge's gavel upholds rights first scrawled on sheepskin parchment. Consider borders. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, mediated by the Pope, split the New World between Spain and Portugal with a line drawn on a map, an act of arrogance that still shapes Latin America's linguistic divide today. Modern diplomats might shudder at its simplicity, but the precedent it set that land could be claimed and divided through signed agreements rather than pure conquest remains the bedrock of international law. Even the chaos of medieval feudal contracts with their labyrinthine obligations evolved into today's tax codes and property deeds, that stack of paperwork you sign when buying a house. It's the direct descendant of a vassal swearing fealty for a parcel of land. Language itself bears the marks of this legacy. Legal phrases like habeas corpus or prima facie aren't just Latin flourishes, they're survivors from a time when law was conducted in a dead language to exclude the uneducated. The very structure of modern contracts, with their clauses and subclauses, mirrors the painstaking precision of monastic charters. A medieval scribe would recognize the fine print in your phone's terms of service as a distant cousin to his carefully worded land grants. Yet the most enduring medieval invention might be bureaucracy itself. The Domesday Book's obsession with cataloging every pig and acre foreshadowed today's census data and GDP reports. What began as a king's tool to maximize taxes now underpins everything from social welfare programs to climate accords. The parchment-bound ledgers of Venetian bankers birthed modern stock markets, their handwritten bills of exchange evolving into today's digital transactions. The irony is delicious. Knights and kings dreamed of immortality through battle, but their lasting victories came from the unglamorous work of clerks. When a 21st century lawyer cites precedent or a historian deciphers a faded charter, they're participating in a tradition older than canons, older than cathedrals. The swords that built feudalism rusted long ago, but the words that bound it still govern us. Every time you vote, pay taxes, or even argue with a parking ticket, you're living in a world shaped by scribes who understood a truth we've since forgotten, that the sharpest tool for changing the world isn't a blade but a pen. From charters to chronicles, the medieval world teaches us that true power often lies not in the sword, but in the written word. The Iron Crown may have symbolized authority, but the paper throne was where real control was wielded. Think about it, Charlemagne's empire stretched across Europe not just because of his armies, but because his scribes standardized laws in writing. The Magna Carta didn't just limit a king's power, it planted the idea that rules could bind even those who wore crowns. And when popes and emperors clashed, their most enduring weapons weren't siege engines, but meticulously drafted decrees and excommunications written in flawless Latin. This shift from brute force to bureaucratic finesse wasn't just a medieval fluke, it's the blueprint for how power operates today. Modern elections are won by campaigns that master narratives, not militias. Corporations wield influence through contracts and patents, not private armies. Even social movements rise and fall on their ability to craft compelling messages, whether printed in pamphlets or tweeted to millions. The medieval scribe hunched over a parchment has a direct descendant in the lawyer drafting legislation or the journalist uncovering corruption. Yet there's a cautionary tale here too. The same tools that tamed feudal chaos could also enforce oppression. Domesday Book's precision made taxation fairer, but it also cemented serfdom. The Church's monopoly on literacy let it rewrite history to suit its agenda. And let's not forget, for every Magna Carta that expanded rights, there were forged charters used to steal land or justify pogroms. The pen's power cuts both ways. It can liberate or enslave, clarify or obfuscate, depending on who holds it. So the next time you scroll through a news feed or sign a digital contract, remember you're participating in a tradition older than castles. The battles we fight today over privacy, disinformation, or free speech are just the latest skirmishes in an ancient war. Not a war of swords, but of stories, not of conquest, but of clauses. And like those medieval monks preserving knowledge in their scriptoriums, we now face our own challenge, safeguarding truth in an age where ink has turned into pixels and parchment into cloud servers. If this journey through the hidden power of words resonated with you, let's keep the conversation going. Drop a comment below. What modern-day paper thrones do you see shaping our world? And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's untold battles. After all, the past isn't just about what happened. It's about understanding the tools that built our present, one carefully chosen word at a time.